Good evening, everyone. My name's Bianca. It's my absolute delight to be here to welcome you to Avid Reader this evening for the launch of the Trauma Banquet. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kenneth Pakenham in conversation with Sarah Klenbort. Dr. Kenneth Pakenham has worked with thousands of clients and extensively researched human behaviour and cutting-edge practices in clinical psychology. In this memoir, he examines his own painful silent trauma echoes that defy eradication and shows how he uses inner pain to cultivate fulfillment. Sarah Klenbort is a prize-winning writer who teaches creative writing and literature at the University of Queensland and memoir at the Queensland Writers' Centre. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, Best Australian Stories, Overland, Southerly, Island, and various anthologies and overseas journals. Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Kenneth and to Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, great. Thank you, Bianca. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming out in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. This may be the last night we all go out, so let's make it memorable, okay? And buy an extra copy for your friend who will need something to read. It's an honor to be here. It was an honor to be requested to be in conversation with Kenneth. It was an extraordinary book, an extraordinary journey that I went on when I read this book. Has anyone read the book already? Yes, okay, great, so you know. I went to a creative writing lecture last week, and the lecturer said, when you write a book, you want it to either be visceral, or intellectual, or empathetic. And as he said those words, I thought, you've done all three with this book. And that's something that we'll see. I'm going to ask Kenneth to read a section in a moment, and you can see all three of the. It's very visceral. You can feel the body in this book. It's incredibly intellectual because Kenneth has a PhD and he's a psychologist and he knows what he's talking about. And it's also extraordinarily empathetic, even when you write about your worst enemies. I think you manage this compassion. So, but I wanted to start with something that struck me, which was very early on in the book. There's a chapter 2, which on its own is just a beautiful chapter in itself, I think. And it's about masculinity. There's this idea that, well, I'll just read that first paragraph, actually. So the start of chapter 2 is, a Kiwi macho male culture dominated my family, with Dad at the helm, demanding that his 4 sons follow in his footsteps. He insisted that his sons excel in the highly esteemed traditional Kiwi male-dominated sports, especially rugby, but also swimming and tennis. Violence and sport reigned supreme. And I wonder if you could talk a little about how it was to grow up in that culture.
So because I didn't fit, it was difficult. And yet, and at some level, I related to the energy of sport, the gutsiness of toughness, but there was another part of me that didn't relate to that preferred gentleness, tenderness. And so I wanted to have both, and it was difficult to know where I fitted because I felt comfortable in both states.
Yeah, and I think that's a theme that runs right through the book, isn't it? Not fitting neatly into a category.
Yeah. So not neatly fitting into a category is in fact, in my view, the case for all of us. Because how can a unique human being with their essential humanity, which is fluid and dynamic and constantly changing, ever neatly fit into a category and always be in that category?
Yeah, and I want to get back to that later because it's a really fascinating thing that comes up again and again throughout this journey. I was just wondering, for those of you who've read it, if someone asked you what the book was about, if someone said, "Oh, what are you reading? What's that?" What would you say?
It's a page turner.
It's a page turner. It is so gripping, isn't it? There were times I was like, I need to go to bed. I can't go to bed. I have to keep reading. Yeah. Any other things that you? Because for me, it was so many different. It was about a boy who lost his mother to suicide at the age of 13 and has to live with this trauma. It was also a psychological novel about how to deal with trauma. It was also about finding success, sort of a rags to riches story. And it's also a memoir of someone who's gender fluid. So it's sort of all of these things, and it defies category. It's like, where would you put it in the bookstore? It defies category. But yes, sorry, do you want to add to that?
So, and that was the case with the publishers. So when we approached traditional publishers, they were unsure of which shelf to put it in. And I thought that was emblematic of my lifelong story of not fitting into a particular shelf neatly. I keep jumping off them. And so does the book. And so because categories are much easier to deal with, and of course categories are important. They have their place, but sometimes categories don't function well.
Yeah. Well, I'd love for you to read from this section, and this is a really powerful section, and it happens right when your mother is committing suicide, and you are there with her, lying there with her as she's dying when you're 13. But again, it's that visceral, intellectual, and empathetic that you do.
Yeah, so I should add that this chapter is the only chapter from an historical, from a history that is written in the present tense. And it's written in the present tense because it's so intimate. It has an intimacy with life that is always in the present, so it didn't make sense to write it as in past tense. So I am, as Sarah says, with my mother, just freshly turned 13, and we're both lying on the bed after she has taken a bottle of poison. But I'm not going to torture you with the probably some of the more intense and graphic bits. This is a reasonably safe section. The intrusive ugliness of the stinking, congealed black jelly vomit and the echoes of the convulsions, crisis and panic recede. A serenity permeates her being and seeps into my heart. We are one. I see Mum shrouded in a veil of dignity, woven by the threads of sustained vulnerability to love in the midst of evil. Mum crosses the gateway to freedom. Freedom from cruel torment and torture that she has endured for nearly 40 years. She enters without anger, hate, bitterness, aggression, or resentment in her heart. She enters exhausted, depleted, weakened, beaten, and battered. She enters carrying the jewels of love, compassion, loyalty, dignity, and gentleness in her heart. In that moment, I am swamped by the paradoxical juxtaposition of so many elements. Mum's ugly self-inflicted dying and her peaceful death. A mother who kills herself, yet has a steadfast love for her children. The agony of losing Mum and the soaring of my deep love for her and respect for her dying. Her calculated, decisive action to kill herself, and her strong, magnetic faith in a God of love and hope. The stench of toxic chemicals and the fragrance of Mum's beauty and peacefulness. The Christian curse on suicide and the right of human dignity to annihilate its life-carrying vessel. And the physical victory of evil violence and the transcendence of love. Mentally, I see these polarized opposites, but in my heart, I see each pair of opposing elements as inextricably connected and part of one entity. In some extraordinary way, this flood of life enigmas makes sense in my heart, and I eat it all. This eating of life's pain and paradoxes will be a lighthouse that guides me for the rest of my life.
So powerful. So you have this story almost of yin and yang here. You can't have one without the other, right? You can't deny the pain. You can't have life without death. And you don't shy away from the experience of your mother's death. Later in the book, other people do, but you never do. And I think that's an interesting decision to put it in the present tense, isn't it? Because it is always with you.
Yes.
Yeah. It's so powerful. It's not all like this. There's very powerful moments, and then there's these sort of joyous, adventures that happen as well in this book. And I'm fascinated by how you resist the mainstream in absolutely everything you ever do. It's very refreshing, and so there's lots of adventures, and there's misadventures, and there's tragedy, and there's highs and lows, and on the streets of Sydney, or in the tobacco fields of northern Queensland. And we don't have time to get to them all, but you should really get the book, because it's really fascinating to read it.
So can I just clarify? Yeah. It is true. Standing outside of mainstream is a comfortable, familiar place for me. But also, I am happy to be in mainstream. So here's the thing. There is no one place in life, in my view, that is always right or always wrong. It needs a contextually sensitive judgment and decision to discern, is this working for me now, being here, doing this, being this way, or is it not? And that's the key question. It's not that mainstream is wrong or right, and it's not being fringe is wrong or right, and there's many places in between. The point is this, is how I'm living my life and how I am expressing my life the best possible way for me to be and to give to others.
And I think that's clear too in the people you're with, because sometimes they're fringe and sometimes they're not. So you do get to quite a dark place. And one of the ways that you get out of this place is a sort of epiphany that you have when you're a cleaner, right? And I wonder if you could read that section on page 118. if you wanted to read along.
Yeah, so this is me working as a cleaner with a lovely elderly Dutch gentleman who's very kind. And it is my re-entry into society. And I come through the religious pathway to re-enter society after having been really on the streets and in difficult places. So I'm still sort of trying to figure where I fit in life and in society and amongst my fellow humans. So, on one occasion, we went to a luxurious 3-level mansion with 5 bedrooms and bathrooms and panoramic views from almost every vantage point. A softly spoken, meek, subtly dishevelled, middle-aged woman greeted us at the front door. Salient was the misapplication of facial makeup in some places, although I don't think Mr. Vanderberg noticed. Her demeanour conveyed intense sadness. It was as if she were hollow. I sensed she was in great emotional pain. I stood staring at her for a few minutes, mesmerised by a sense of her suffering. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder and Mr. Vanderberg's lilting Dutch accent directing me indoors. The woman escorted us into the house and we began cleaning. While I cleaned, I was preoccupied with my sense of the woman's anguish. The image of her standing at the door floated in and out of my mind. When I cleaned the master bedroom, I discovered bottles of sedatives and sleeping medications, and in the ensuite, hidden behind the laundry basket, was a bottle of whiskey. I continued cleaning. Then I had an epiphany, a sudden, lucid realization that the woman of the house was no different from me. We were both humans, vulnerable to suffering. She suffered, and I suffered. In fact, none of the people inhabiting these mansions were different from me. We were all human, living in a mansion and conforming to conventional social mores. Living on the street or dwelling in a hippie commune didn't change one's humanity. The type of house a person lived in, a person's family background, wealth, education, religion, race, sexual orientation, social etiquette, and so on, only form a Teflon coating to our fundamental humanity. Nothing changes our humanity. What a relief. I didn't have to fight and rebel anymore. Feeling that I was an alien no longer represented a truth. I had been duped by differences in Teflon, believing that some forms of Teflon were superior to others and that a better Teflon coating made you a better person. Fighting against variations in Teflon made no sense. What's important is beneath the surface, our raw humanity. I realised that in basing my interactions on Teflon, I had discounted the humanity in me and the other person. With this revelation, I felt connected to and part of the massive river of humanity.
Wow. So you have this compassion for all of those around you, even those who are better off, who are luckier, who have mansions. And you even had a compassion for, what I noticed actually is for your former self. Did you always have that, or is that something that came with writing, or is it something?
I think I had a natural, I don't know how to explain it was organic sense that of the goodness of life, and this is the irony that in some way my mother imparts this as a model of sustained tenderness, caring in an aggressive and violent situation. And so I can only imagine that it infused within me from that experience, and there was this sense of the goodness of life no matter what form it took.
I find that really fascinating, especially when it going back to your father, who your family sees as a monster, as a violent monster, but you don't see it that way.
I see what he did. I see his actions as destructive and horrific. But if I am true to the sense that I have within me, that life is the same in all human beings, and we have this common humanity, then where do I go? I see this behaviour that's abhorrent, but I also see within the person that expresses the abhorrent behaviour humanity, the same humanity that exists within me.
That's really powerful. I wonder, it seems, I think it's maybe time for you to read another section which speaks to these things as well. So the story goes on, the journey goes on, you find success in having a family and having a very successful academic career, both a practice and as a lecturer, and yet the trauma haunts you, and things are still difficult. And so you find a way to deal with it, right? On page 175.
Yeah. I'm aware that, so just to set the context a little, so this is where I feel that I have lost my essence, and this is an extremely painful state. It's a state of non-being. It's a sense of existing but not existing. The trigger for that was the breakdown of my marriage, and I know my family is here, and thank you for coming. But this is the trigger, and so this is my response, and but I find, but it causes me to search, and in searching, I find ways to deal with feeling as if my essence has died. In practicing being present and reading about acceptance and mindfulness, I more fully discovered the part of me that was beyond my thoughts, memories, feelings, urges, and bodily sensations. A part of me that was able to notice them. This was my awareness. From my awareness, I noticed my inner experiencing. Therefore, my awareness was not my thoughts, memories, feelings, urges, and bodily sensations. It was something more than these experiences. I realized that my life experiences had left their imprints on these mental, emotional, and physical faculties, but not on my awareness. This meant my awareness was not touched by my life experiences, including Dad's violence, Mum's suicide, the school bashings, alienations, the deaths I'd witnessed, my health crisis, and the marriage separation. I realised that my awareness had been with me all my life and remained constant, perfect, and untouched. Then came the revelation that my awareness was in fact my essence, therefore it could not die. It was unaffected by the marital separation crisis. Nothing could defile or annihilate my essence. This realization was massively freeing. It offered a safe place within me from where I could observe my discomfort. The I within me had not died. It dawned on me that if my essence had been with me since the beginning and is perfect, untouched by life experiences, the I within me was already whole. I was not a defective, inadequate, freakish human being. I no longer had to chase being a whole person. I just needed to keep returning to my essence and be guided by its silent witness to my living. I had accessed this transcendent part of self, my essence, many times before, but my sense of it was primitive and unformulated. Through my essence, I had perceived the oneness of life and death as Mum was dying. Through my awareness, I had gained a sense of life being continuous. I realised it was only language that divided it into categories, normal and faggot, good and bad, black and white, positive and negative, smart and stupid, success and failure, me and you. They were just mind-made concepts. I got a clearer glimpse into this insight when I had the epiphany while working as a cleaner. At that time, I realised the labels we use to categorise and describe ourselves and fellow humans only referred to the superficial, just Teflon, which obscured our view of the underlying raw humanity that connected us all.
That's brilliant. And it also reminds me of earlier in the book when you talk about being labelled as gay, you know, sort of living in the gay epicenter of Sydney and King's Cross. And you write, I didn't want to be confined to that label, to a label, a culture, or a community. I just wonder if you could just speak a little bit more to that. I mean, why? It's something we do a lot these days. You know, we are sort of obsessed with identity and being a part of one of these groups. And isn't it good to be part of a community and feel that you share something with them? Or what is the danger of that?
So I think being a part of a community is essential for survival. But, and I think labels like identity concepts, you know, we use terms like self-concept or self-identity, and we label various parts of ourselves. Now, as I said before, the labels have some usefulness. They're the way we communicate, and in a sense, the use of labels and language separate us from animals that are not able to use language and make sense in a representative way that language allows us to do. Language is not real in the sense that, you know, a word is just, a word describes something that perhaps has a physical reality. It is representational. So that's fine. And that's a very useful, skillful thing to manage, language. But when language defines something that is constantly dynamic and changing, like life, in the next few moments, I am not going to be the same as I am now in incredibly small ways. And then if you think of that over moments and moments and months and years, I'm constantly changing. And are my concepts changing? Language is static. So I use the term gay, but it points, it does no more than point to one aspect of me. And that aspect often changes. My sexuality changes. My sexual preferences changes. My sexual likes and dislikes change. Not hugely, but they do. And so where do you go with these terms? So I use them, but I want to use them only so far as they help me to communicate and connect with people and live my life fully. When they start to interfere with my connection with people, living my life fully, then I need to readjust and review.
That's fascinating, and that does connect to something you talk about later in the book, which is emotions and how we are never happy and then sad, that everything is fluid and runs into each other.
Yeah.
So that fluidity, I think, it moves throughout the book. It's almost mirrored in the way that it's structured as well. It's quite brilliant. So, and it also kind of reminds me of this other bit that you say at the end, which I love, which is, you go on to develop these ideas in your professional life, and you're very critical of pop psychology, right? Of this. On page 205, you write, I feel like exploding when I hear the trite pop psychology cliches that are thrown about like stardust. Be positive. Leave your past behind. Move on. Lean into it. Our difficulties are our teachers. Look on the bright side. And it's true, I find these inspirational phrases everywhere. I'm sure you all do, on posters and diaries and around the sort of ethereal universe that is social media. And so why do you explode when you see these little phrases?
Because humans are more complex than these phrases suggest. And these phrases often suggest that positive is somehow intrinsically better than negative, remembering that positive is simply a word, negative is simply a word, and we know they have dictionary meanings, but no more than that. They aren't like an entity. And so there's this sense that, and so it's the, in a sense, it's the core story that all of life and living is important, worthwhile, and has goodness.
Yeah.
And yet we carve it up and we say that's bad and that's good, and we do it to the life within us. This is good, that's bad, don't like that, like that. How can you carve something? How can you carve water? How can you carve and dissect and categorize air?
Yes. And I want to kind of involve you all as well in this, because are there any writers here tonight? Is there anyone who writes? Don't be shy. Yeah. I bet there's more than that. But you said when we first met, and you wanted to write this book, and whenever you want to do something, you just do it. That's one thing that I've learned about you from reading your memoir. Is this extraordinary determination, and nothing will stand in your way, and you do it. And so you went to all these writers' conferences, and you went to all these workshops, and you looked around and you said, all you writers, you're psychologists. Yeah. Why do you say that? You just don't have the terminology. You said, yeah.
Well, so I think that the writers, I think all artists are wonderful psychologists, and I think all artists, whether it's through dance or music or song or writing, painting, sculpturing, express the understandings and insights of humans and human behaviour that science, I don't think, adequately captures or expresses. And that's why we need artists, as well as scientists, as well as religion, and as well as so many other aspects. These are all the richness of the expression of our humanity. So when I was learning how to write like this, not academically but more creatively, I would be mixing and talking with other writers, and their understandings and insights into human behaviour, which they needed in order to be able to create characters, to bring a plot together, insights and understanding around humans and human behaviour were necessary to achieve those artistic expressions. And they were beautiful. And it's so important that we have that contribution.
Well, and you are a writer now too, as this book is evidence of.
Wow.
Yeah. I just wonder, in terms of writing the memoir, I think what a lot of people struggle with when they sit down to write a memoir is what to leave out. There's so much of a life. You can't possibly write it all down and make it a compelling book.
Yes.
But you did make it really compelling. How did you choose what to leave out, or was that a challenge, or did it?
So I because it was memoir, and you would know more about this, Sarah, than me. Because it was memoir, I wanted to make it thematic rather than chronological or factual, or this happens and then that happens. Now, to some extent, that is the case, but I wanted to keep the key themes prominent and have them the most colourful weave. I wanted the themes to have more colour in the fabric as they're woven than the making sense of the progression. And I just prompt me again with the question.
Was it hard to figure out what to leave out, or to find the arc of the narrative?
Yeah. So no, because of that weave. I had that weave strongly in place. I went for a walk with a colleague friend that's known me for probably 30 or 40 years, and she said, you didn't talk about your rich life with your children and your family, and so there were things that I did leave out, but I left them out strategically to keep the weave, the colourful weave, prominent.
Well, it is very colourful, for sure. There's so many fabulous characters in this memoir too. I mean, think of Esther.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Esther, because she was quite an important person.
She was very
in your
important.
life. Yeah.
So I met Esther at about the age of 18, she was a friend of my sister-in-law, and I met her through visiting my brother and his wife. And the meeting is the seduction chapter, and she brings out this the more artistic, soft, non-macho side, and she welcomes it, and she says, I can spot this colour in you, and she draws it out, and of course I feel immensely seduced, and it's lovely, and of course she is full of colour herself in the way she lives her life. So we develop a friendship, and I end up leaving New Zealand and going to Australia, living on the coast. And she has a history in King's Cross, and I discover that she is essentially a high-class call girl. And she lives on the edge of life in every way, all the time. But again, within this person who at times would seem degraded by an observer looking at her, within this person is a unique human being that has life the same as I have life. And so I learn so much from her about myself and about dark corners of society. And
you didn't run from those dark corners either,
no,
did you?
I like them. I still do to some extent. That's the problem. Well, is it a problem? I don't know.
Yeah, or maybe not. You know, to embrace all of it.
Yeah.
I think is.
Yeah.
And another writer might have, you know, called her a heroin addict and a whore, but
Yeah.
she is so much more than that, isn't she?
Yes. Yes. And so the labels, you know,
Yeah.
whore, heroin addict, it loses. For her, it would lose all her talents, her strengths, her humour, her inclusiveness, her loyalty, incredible loyalty. You know, it was like cutting our veins and rubbing blood together. These other wonderful qualities would be simply subsumed by the labels of whore, drug addict.
Absolutely. And she was such a ticket to freedom
Yes.
in so many ways, to
Yes.
escape that sort of provincial, can we say?
Yeah. We can.
Life. And be opened up to this whole other world.
Yeah.
And even the character of Lorenzo, who is, you know, you go up north and you work in this tobacco farm, and it's backbreaking work, and here's this immigrant from Italy, and you don't really have anything in common with him,
Yeah.
I don't think.
No.
And yet he takes you in and provides a sort of family
Yes.
that you hadn't had
Yes.
in many ways before.
Yeah. It was just another lesson on the richness of humanity. This time, the tobacco picking experience where I lived with these Italian families in Little Italy, Mariba, up in near Cairns, I just enjoy and savour the cultural richness. And so now through that experience, I get exposed to food, the other languages, other ways of, non-verbal behaviour that's culturally embedded. And so I get this other wonderful angle of the richness, the magnificence, the beauty of being human.
Yeah, absolutely. And with all of these are just some of with all of the adventures, that's really apparent in your book. I have more questions, but I wonder if anyone in the audience has any questions about anything we've been talking about, or anything about the book, or this fabulous cover. Yes.
May I bring up the topic of religion, which you haven't done so? You don't strike me as a person who would now have a strong religious belief, and yet you did. You were seduced as a young boy by Billy Graham, as was I.
Yeah.
And you've continued with that religious belief well into your adulthood. At times where I would have thought religion would have played no part. I'm wondering why you stayed with religion for such a long time before you did eventually break loose.
Can I just repeat that question for those of you who haven't heard it? We haven't talked about religion yet, and he said, you don't strike me as a religious person, but you were seduced by Billy Graham, and it stayed with you for so long. And why is that?
I think that I learn about religion from my mother, but I also sense as a young person who doesn't go into religion using intellect a lot, because I'm young, I'm still operating with sensing my way. So I am being influenced by two things: the belief system that the religion presents, and I'm also sensing spirituality. and those two things become a little confusing at times. So religion provides me with, later in my adolescence, it provides me with a pathway off the streets into mainstream society with possibilities, because I have a home, I have 3 meals a day, and I have security. And that comes through, the Christian kindness, but with the cost of salvation. So I move with all of that because it makes sense in terms of my learnings from my mother as a young person and her religious beliefs. And I stay with that because the world is still very, for me, I feel fragile. I'm not really sure of myself still. And so the way I find a strength within myself is to be grounded in the religion, but also trying to foster spirituality. It becomes an important security for me. And then I begin to discover that there are lots of religions, and each religion has a belief system, and each religion has practices and ways to try to cultivate spirituality. And then I see common threads among all the religions. And then I see some of the spiritual traditions that are less dominated by dogma, all saying the same thing. And then I discover Western science is starting to harness some of the spiritual principles and energy. And then I think, so I don't really, if I don't want to and if I don't need a belief system, I can still cultivate spirituality, that transcendent part of our humanity that is critical for our survival and for the fullness of our living. So I slowly developed a bigger picture. But there was one thing I didn't do, and I still don't do, and I don't want to do it, is I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Nothing is all bad. And the religions have been around for centuries. And there are wonderful writings and art and music and singing that all point to this transcendent part of human beings. So there's stuff there to be understood and to know, but again, without being confined and squashed and buried by terminology and words.
Thank you for that question. Yeah. And any other questions in the audience? Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm very interested in your therapist later in life. When you were 13 years old and this happened, you didn't go to therapy. And now, kids go through losing parents, for example, say you have to take your child to see a therapist. You have to, because this is, their kids right now say, I'm thinking of killing myself, why should I live, and things like that. And I suppose your question about religion, probably that's why you didn't kill yourself, because you had this belief. Do you think if you had the option of therapy when you were 13 years old, it would have been helpful?
Yeah, so you didn't have therapy as a 13-year-old. Would that have been helpful? Of course, every 13-year-old, or most of them, would be offered that now if their mother committed suicide. Yeah.
I think it would have, in the sense that I would have had someone, like a therapist would then, in a way, served as a mentor or as someone to guide and someone to listen to how I felt about my mother's suicide. So no one wanted to talk about my mother's suicide. It was taboo in the 1960s, and to some extent it still is now. So a therapist, and going into therapy, would have provided me with opportunities to explore what was unspeakable in the community. And it may have helped me make better decisions that were less destructive, self-destructive later. It would have given me that sort of like wise person, that mentor, that person that could guide. But of course, you know, there was no sort of therapy really in rural New Zealand in the 1950s, 60s in an accessible, obvious way. But I think that at the same time, there is a tendency to pathologize difficult life experiences that are natural. Death is natural, it's wholesome, it is a part of living, it's an essential part of life. And we pathologize loss and difficulties and so forth. And so I think that we should take care not to overreact to what is natural in the course of living.
Right. These are great question. Yeah. Any other questions that we have? Yep.
In your reflections back, showing a lot of great understanding of events in your life. I'm wondering though, and you talk about self-destructive period, I'm wondering about anger and whether there was, how anger fitted into all these events that were going on.
Asking about anger. Where did anger fit into all of these self-reflective thoughts? Yeah.
I'm not sure. I think that because I'd seen so much violence, I probably compensated for my distaste for violence and aggression and harshness to other people, that I probably cultivated a much more acquiescing side to myself, and strengthened my preference for tenderness and kindness. And but that doesn't mean that I didn't and don't experience anger. So anger comes and goes, but it was mostly never a strong force. And I think that so part of that, as a male, so I identify as a male. So I think that what really helped me was that I was willing to embrace my femininity. So as a male, I had the physical strength, and in a sense I had the privileges that come with males and being dominant and so forth. But I also knew the rejection and alienation that came from being male and not fitting neatly into being male. And then I had femininity. And, welcoming tenderness and an ease with being with other people and feeling comfortable talking about emotions and all of that thing that's typically associated with femininity was an incredible balance to developing anger. So my siblings express anger very readily and very easily. But they didn't have the opportunity that I had to wrestle with femininity.
And it's something you accept from quite a young age, it seems to me, which is also quite remarkable.
Well, femininity, masculinity is attractive, but femininity is attractive. The qualities that are typically associated with femininity are very rich and desirable and attractive. And so the qualities with masculinity are also, but why not have both?
Absolutely, and I'm sure that helps to engage with your patients as well. Right? Yeah. And I wanted to touch on something you mentioned earlier, which is that, of course, you're still lecturing.
Yes.
And you've developed a new course for this semester.
Yes.
And perhaps now your students are able to read,
Yes.
not only your academic work,
Yes.
but this very personal memoir.
Yes.
That speaks to your academic
Yes,
work. And
yes.
how does that feel, and what is
Yes.
that like?
Well, I felt I was terrified. So there's two things. I had decided to write the memoir while I was still working and circulating in the real world. I wanted to be transparent. So that's one of the things that I cherish is transparency and honesty, see-through. And so the best way for me to do that was not to go and retire in my bedroom in my house and cut off from the world and write my memoir and publish it. I wanted this to be with me, and I wanted to have the courage to be transparent in this way. And so I made a deliberate decision to write the memoir while I was still working and publicly exposed and functioning. The first time my editor read the manuscript, she wrote a 9-page report, and at the very beginning up front she said, "I am of two minds about you publishing the memoir while you are still working and in the public eye." But she said, on the other hand, in doing that, you can also maximise communication and a message. I reassured her that I had thought about the former and the potential consequences. But when the book was actually published, I was frightened about how people would see me. And so when I would walk down the corridor and I'd sit in front of 100-odd students in my classroom, if they want to, they know that, or at least the back of it. And some of my students are here tonight. But people, so here's the thing. If there is this common humanity, then I've put it to the test, because I have exposed my raw humanity, but my raw humanity is no different to the humanity that is in my students. And so could it be the case that if I expose my humanity, it will register with the humanity in them, and they will maybe have some compassion, or maybe have some tolerance or acceptance or even welcoming. And maybe then they feel more connected to their humanity. And so the end result now, 6 weeks after the book being released officially, I feel incredible inner power that I have nothing to hide. People would often say to me, how would you feel your students in front of you knowing about all of that? And I thought, I may feel uncomfortable, but in a sense, what do I have to hide? What is there to hide? There is nothing new under the sun. We're all human and we're all vulnerable to essentially similar difficulties and pain.
Absolutely, and I feel like that's a good note to end on, that you have done this, you have exposed yourself in this beautiful book, and yet it's still such a good story. I feel like we were talking about it in an intellectual way tonight, and it's that as well, but it's also a page turner of a story, and I was so...
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because you're the expert in stories and literary skills and knowledge. So that you say that it is a story.
Absolutely, and it has all of these elements of a story, because you have to have character, and it has these brilliant characters, and you have to have setting, and it has it's very rich settings that you paint, and it has plot, and it has resolution, and it has all of the elements of a great story, and yet it's more than that, because it's also giving us an option to live a little bit differently with the way that, with what we do with our pain that we all have. We're all human, as you say. That maybe we can eat our pain, you talk about, that we can digest it. And I think that's a fascinating concept. And but you bring it to us in this story, which I really loved reading. So thank you so much for doing it. Yeah. It was 2 years that he did it while he was working full time, which I'm a little bit jealous of. But
and so the big jump was to write not academically or in a science way, but to write in a raw, creative, heartfelt way. So making that shift was hard, but at the same time it was rewarding and fulfilling.
And really honest. That's the hardest thing my memoir students have, is actually revealing themselves, which is what the whole thing is about. But it's also the hardest thing to do. Yeah. But you absolutely reveal yourself in this book, and it's really brilliant. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and stick around, because we're going to have signings, and you can talk to Kenneth individually as well, because I know some of you probably have some questions that you don't want to ask in front of everyone else. But yes, and thank you all so much for coming out tonight. It's really brilliant.
And can I make some acknowledgements?
Yes, absolutely.
Firstly, thank you, Sarah, for being my conversational partner. I discovered Sarah when I got one of the Queensland Writer Centre e-bulletin newsletters, and I needed to find a conversational partner. I had no idea, because I'm not well connected in the writing community, because I have a full-time job, and that's my major connection. So it was difficult for me to think, where will I find someone? And then I saw this person, Sarah, who was going to be running a memoir workshop for the Queensland Writers Centre. And then I looked her up, and she was at the University of Queensland. She had recently moved to the University of Queensland, so she was a fellow colleague in a way. And so I just, out of the blue, sent her an email and said, would you be willing? And she was willing to consider it. We met for coffee. She took the book, and we never saw each other again until tonight. I am more than thrilled to have had you as my conversational partner. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
For that. I would also like to thank you all for coming on a COVID-19 night. Thank you very, very much, because I know it's been difficult. There's lots of people that couldn't come because of vulnerabilities that they had, and so they couldn't attend, so that's unfortunate. But my book cover designer, everyone should know about, because the book cover designer has been so popular, is Daniel Streetfield, and he's been video recording the conversation and the event. So thank you, and thank you for coming, and for Avid Reader hosting the event. Avid Reader is one of my favourite bookshops, so thank you very much. Books. I welcome your view.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again, and we'll speak.